You can usually feel fake people before you can explain them. That's what makes them dangerous. Because deception in adult life rarely arrives looking dangerous. It arrives looking emotionally intelligent, calm, self-aware, supportive. Some fake people spend years learning how to appear trustworthy because appearance gives them access long before honesty ever could. And honestly, that's why they are so difficult to detect. The person does not look manipulative. They look emotionally fluent. They know how to mirror your humor, your values, your frustrations. After a while, talking to them starts feeling strangely easy, almost like they became the exact version of a person you naturally lower your guard around. But eventually, something shifts. Not dramatically, quietly. You tell them something good finally happened in your life. They smile. They congratulate you. The words sound right. But 2 seconds later, the energy changes. The enthusiasm fades too quickly. The conversation slowly returns to them. Or they suddenly become emotionally flat, as if your happiness created distance instead of connection. Small moment, big signal. Envy becomes dangerous when it learns how to smile politely. You've probably felt this before without fully trusting yourself. Walking away from certain conversations feeling emotionally heavy, even though nothing openly negative happened. No argument, no insult, no obvious hostility. Just a strange internal tension you cannot logically explain. And because there is no clear evidence, most people immediately start betraying their own instincts. Maybe I'm imagining it. Maybe they didn't mean it that way. Maybe I'm being unfair. So they ignore the pattern. But fake people rarely reveal themselves through one dramatic betrayal. They reveal themselves through repeated emotional inconsistencies. Tiny fractures between their words, their reactions, their timing, and who they quietly become once attention is no longer on them. Pay attention to that part. Who someone becomes when the spotlight leaves them will usually tell you more than who they are while everyone is watching. Because performance requires an audience. And this is where emotionally intelligent people often become vulnerable. They try so hard to understand behavior that they stop objectively observing it. They explain away discomfort. They over-contextualize disrespect. They give endless emotional permission to people who have not earned that level of trust. Meanwhile, fake people study emotional access carefully. Some people do not connect with your vulnerability. They study it. That is why certain individuals can appear supportive for months, sometimes years, before their real intentions become fully visible. Not because the signs were absent, but because the signals arrived in fragments instead of conclusions, a delayed smile, a competitive tone hidden inside a compliment, warmth in public, distance in private, interest when you are useful, disappearance when you are not. Curiosity about your weaknesses disguised as concern. The pattern forms slowly, and once you finally see it clearly, you start realizing something uncomfortable. The most dangerous fake people are usually not loud, aggressive, or obviously toxic. They are the people who learned how to perform sincerity well enough to bypass your defenses before the mask finally slips. The first silent sign of a fake person is not obvious hostility. It is emotional inconsistency. And once you notice it, you start seeing it everywhere. A genuine person may have flaws. They may be stressed, distracted, emotionally awkward sometimes, but their presence usually feels stable. You know where you stand with them. Their reactions match the moment. Their support feels natural instead of strategically performed. Fake people are different. Their behavior changes depending on what emotionally benefits them in that specific moment. That's why some people seem deeply supportive while your life is falling apart, but strangely uncomfortable once you begin rebuilding it. Stay with me here. You lose confidence, and suddenly they are emotionally available all the time. They check on you, they advise you, they reassure you. But the moment you become more confident, more disciplined, more respected, or emotionally stronger, something quietly changes in the relationship. The warmth becomes inconsistent, not openly cold, just different. The words stay warm, the energy does not. You tell them good news, and they react correctly, but not naturally. The smile looks slightly delayed, the enthusiasm fades too fast. 2 minutes later, the conversation somehow returns to them again. Small moment, big signal, because some people only feel comfortable around the version of you that needs them. And that realization changes how you see people forever. A lot of fake individuals do not consciously think, I want this person to fail. It's more subtle than that. Your growth quietly disrupts the emotional role they assign to you, the insecure one, the struggling one, the dependent one, the less confident one. And once you stop playing that role, their behavior starts revealing emotional tension they can no longer fully hide. That tension leaks through small things, a compliment with hidden comparison inside it, sarcasm disguised as humor, support that feels performative instead of sincere, curiosity that feels more investigative than caring. You've probably felt this before without naming it clearly. Someone asks personal questions that sound thoughtful, but you leave the conversation feeling emotionally exposed instead of understood. Later, those same insecurities quietly reappear during conflict, jokes, tension, or subtle criticism. That's when you realize something uncomfortable. Some people were never listening to understand you. They were listening to learn where you were vulnerable. And fake people are often extremely observant. Because performance requires observation, they study reactions, weak points, emotional needs, insecurities, what gives them influence, what gives them access, what version of themselves works best around different people. That's why they can feel emotionally adaptive at first. But eventually, adaptation creates contradictions, and contradictions always leak somewhere. Pay attention to how people react when attention leaves them. Pay attention to who becomes distant when your life improves. Pay attention to whether someone feels emotionally calm around your success or emotionally unsettled by it. Because fake people usually reveal themselves indirectly long before they reveal themselves openly. If you've been finding value in this video, leave a like. It genuinely helps the channel reach more people who need this kind of clarity. And if you want more videos about psychology, emotional intelligence, and human behavior, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Now, here's where this becomes even more revealing. The second sign fake people cannot hide forever has nothing to do with kindness, charm, or support. It appears the moment they stop being the center of attention. The second silent sign of a fake person appears when they are no longer the emotional center of the room. That's when their behavior becomes harder to control. Some people seem calm, charismatic, emotionally balanced, even deeply supportive, as long as attention keeps flowing toward them, as long as they feel admired, needed, respected, included, or emotionally important. But the moment attention shifts away from them, something subtle starts happening. Their energy changes. You've probably seen this before without consciously analyzing it. A group conversation is flowing naturally. Someone else starts telling a story. Another person receives praise. Attention moves across the room for a few minutes, and suddenly, one person becomes different. They interrupt more. They force jokes harder. They start subtly redirecting the conversation back toward themselves. Or they emotionally disappear altogether. Small reactions, massive information. Attention does not reveal character by itself, but the loss of attention often does. That distinction matters more than most people realize, because emotionally secure people usually tolerate shared attention naturally. They can listen without needing control. They can watch someone else succeed, speak, shine, or receive validation without internally shrinking because of it. Fake people often struggle with that. Not always loudly, not always consciously, but emotionally, you can feel it. And once you notice this pattern, certain relationships start looking completely different. You realize some people were never fully relaxed around equality. They felt comfortable when they were guiding the emotional atmosphere, receiving validation, appearing impressive, or maintaining subtle social control. Because for fake people, connection is often tied to positioning. Some people do not want connection. They want positioning. And positioning requires constant reinforcement. That's why attention becomes psychologically addictive for them. Not because attention itself matters, but because attention stabilizes the image they are trying to maintain. The admired person, the important person, the emotionally superior person, the most needed person in the room. But the moment that image stops being emotionally fed, cracks start appearing. Sometimes it looks like passive-aggressive humor. Sometimes it looks like sudden withdrawal. Sometimes it becomes subtle criticism disguised as honesty. Sometimes they lose interest the second the conversation is no longer emotionally useful to them. And sometimes the shift is even darker than that. You notice they seemed more emotionally engaged when your life was falling apart than when it started improving. That realization is uncomfortable, but many people have experienced it. Some individuals only know how to feel emotionally significant when someone around them feels uncertain, weaker, lost, insecure, or dependent. Your pain gave them relevance. Your growth removed it. And once that dynamic changes, the warmth changes too. The relationship was never equal. It was emotionally positional. That line explains more relationships than most people realize, because fake people often build social dynamics around invisible emotional leverage, approval, dependence, validation, attention. They feel safest when they unconsciously occupy the stronger emotional position inside the relationship. That's why emotionally grounded people quietly disrupt them. A grounded person notices tension. They notice performative behavior. They notice emotional competition hidden inside support. They notice when kindness feels strategically timed instead of naturally expressed. And fake people feel that awareness immediately. That's why some relationships become colder the moment you stop seeking approval from the person. Not because you became difficult, because your independence removed emotional leverage they quietly depended on. Pay attention to people who need to reclaim the room whenever attention leaves them. Pay attention to people who subtly deteriorate when admiration disappears. Pay attention to who can genuinely sit inside someone else's success, without emotionally repositioning themselves inside the moment. Because people reveal their character very clearly once validation stops feeding the identity they worked so hard to perform. And eventually, fake people stop carefully managing that performance altogether, especially during moments of frustration. That's when the next sign begins revealing who they really are. The third silent sign of a fake person usually appears during frustration, because frustration weakens performance. As long as life feels controlled, many fake people can carefully manage their image. They know how to sound mature, patient, emotionally aware. They know how to maintain the version of themselves they want other people to believe. But pressure changes people, especially people whose personality depends heavily on perception. And this is where something important happens. The real personality often leaks through emotional inconvenience long before it appears during emotional comfort. Pay attention to how someone behaves when they do not get what they want. Pay attention to how they react when they are ignored, contradicted, corrected, disappointed, embarrassed, excluded, emotionally challenged, because frustration exposes emotional structure. A genuinely grounded person may become upset, defensive, or emotional sometimes. Everyone does. But even inside frustration, there is usually consistency. Their values remain recognizable. Their respect does not completely disappear the moment emotions become uncomfortable. Fake people are different. The moment the performance becomes difficult to maintain, subtle hostility starts leaking through the cracks, not always through screaming, sometimes through tone, through sarcasm, through dismissiveness, through emotional punishment, through carefully timed disrespect that gives them plausible deniability afterward. The real personality usually appears the moment performance stops being convenient. You've probably experienced this before. Someone who seemed calm for months suddenly becomes cruel the first time you disappoint them. Someone who looked emotionally supportive becomes cold the moment you stop agreeing with them. Someone who praised your honesty suddenly punishes you for expressing a truth they did not want to hear. That shift matters, because emotionally mature people usually want resolution during tension. Fake people often want emotional control. And those are not the same thing. Watch what happens when they lose control of the emotional atmosphere. Some people become subtly vindictive the moment they no longer feel admired, obeyed, emotionally prioritized, or socially superior. At first, the behavior is small. A passive-aggressive comment, a joke designed to embarrass you slightly, silence used like punishment, warmth withdrawn strategically, respect becoming conditional, small behaviors, huge information. And the dangerous part is that fake people often know exactly how far they can go without looking openly toxic. That's why so many people leave these interactions confused instead of certain. Nothing seems dramatic enough to justify confrontation, but something always feels emotionally contaminated afterward, because manipulation becomes most effective when it remains deniable. Stay with me here. One of the clearest signs of emotional authenticity is consistency under discomfort. Not perfection, consistency. Can the person still communicate respectfully when frustrated? Can they tolerate disagreement without subtly attacking your character? Can they handle not being validated every moment? Can they stay emotionally stable when the interaction no longer benefits their ego? Those moments reveal everything, because fake people often mistake emotional control for emotional maturity. But emotionally mature people do not need to punish others in order to stabilize themselves internally. Fake people often do. And once you start paying attention to how someone behaves during frustration instead of comfort, certain masks become impossible to ignore. Because pressure does not create character, it reveals the parts of character performance was temporarily hiding. The fourth silent sign of a fake person is subtle emotional competition. And this is one of the hardest signs to detect because it rarely looks aggressive on the surface. In fact, many fake people appear supportive while secretly competing with you emotionally at the exact same time. That contradiction confuses people. Because consciously, the person sounds encouraging. They compliment you. They stay close to you. They continue acting supportive socially. But underneath the interaction, there is a quiet tension that never fully disappears. You feel it most when something good starts happening in your life. A new opportunity, more confidence, better relationships, emotional growth, attention, recognition, peace. That's when subtle competition often begins leaking through behavior, not openly, quietly. The easiest way to expose insecure people is to improve your life around them. Pay attention to certain reactions. Some people become strangely quieter when you succeed. Some immediately redirect attention toward themselves. Some minimize your progress through humor. Some suddenly become emotionally unavailable during your happiest seasons. And some begin treating your growth like emotional distance instead of something worth celebrating. That shift matters, because genuine people usually experience connection when the people they love grow. Fake people often experience comparison, and comparison changes behavior. Suddenly, your success becomes psychologically uncomfortable for them, because your growth silently challenges the image they built around themselves, especially if they unconsciously depended on feeling wiser, stronger, more successful, more attractive, more emotionally stable, or more needed than you. Now pay attention to this carefully. A lot of emotional competition does not sound hateful. It sounds subtle. Backhanded compliments, support mixed with sarcasm, curiosity mixed with comparison, advice that quietly lowers your confidence instead of strengthening it. You've probably experienced moments where someone technically said something positive, but the interaction still left you feeling emotionally reduced afterward. That feeling is important because emotionally healthy support usually feels expansive. Fake support often feels psychologically narrowing. Some people clap for you while quietly hoping you do not outgrow the version of yourself they felt comfortable around. And over time, this creates strange contradictions inside the relationship. They say they support you, but disappear when you evolve. They say they want the best for you, but become emotionally distant when life finally improves for you. They stay connected to your struggles, but disconnected from your confidence. That pattern reveals more than words ever will. Some people only love the version of you that makes them feel emotionally secure. That realization is painful, but it explains many relationships adults silently struggle to understand, especially friendships built during periods where both people were emotionally wounded, insecure, lost, or dependent on external validation. Because once one person starts healing, growing, or emotionally stabilizing, hidden imbalance starts surfacing. And fake people often cannot fully hide the discomfort that creates inside them. Not because they are evil, but because insecurity becomes dangerous when identity depends on comparison. That's why emotionally secure people feel calming to be around. They do not compete with your happiness. They do not subtly punish your growth. They do not emotionally withdraw the moment you stop needing them. They can simply witness your success without feeling psychologically reduced by it. And that ability is far rarer than most people realize. Because the next sign fake people cannot hide forever goes even deeper than emotional competition. Eventually, fake people start revealing themselves through inconsistency between how they treat you publicly and how they treat you privately. The fourth silent sign of a fake person is subtle emotional competition. And this is one of the hardest signs to detect because it rarely looks aggressive on the surface. In fact, many fake people appear supportive while secretly competing with you emotionally at the exact same time. That contradiction confuses people. Because consciously, the person sounds encouraging. They compliment you. They stay close to you. They continue acting supportive socially. But underneath the interaction, there's a quiet tension that never fully disappears. You feel it most when something good starts happening in your life. A new opportunity, more confidence, better relationships, emotional growth, attention, recognition, peace. That's when subtle competition often begins leaking through behavior, not openly, quietly. The easiest way to expose insecure people is to improve your life around them. Pay attention to certain reactions. Some people become strangely quieter when you succeed. Some immediately redirect attention toward themselves. Some minimize your progress through humor. Some suddenly become emotionally unavailable during your happiest seasons. And some begin treating your growth like emotional distance instead of something worth celebrating. That shift matters, because genuine people usually experience connection when the people they love grow. Fake people often experience comparison, and comparison changes behavior. Suddenly, your success becomes psychologically uncomfortable for them, because your growth silently challenges the image they built around themselves, especially if they unconsciously depended on feeling wiser, stronger, more successful, more attractive, more emotionally stable, or more needed than you. Now pay attention to this carefully. A lot of emotional competition does not sound hateful. It sounds subtle. Backhanded compliments, support mixed with sarcasm, curiosity mixed with comparison. Advice that quietly lowers your confidence instead of strengthening it. You've probably experienced moments where someone technically said something positive, but the interaction still left you feeling emotionally reduced afterward. That feeling is important, because emotionally healthy support usually feels expansive. Fake support often feels psychologically narrowing. Some people clap for you while quietly hoping you do not outgrow the version of yourself they felt comfortable around. And over time, this creates strange contradictions inside the relationship. They say they support you, but disappear when you evolve. They say they want the best for you, but become emotionally distant when life finally improves for you. They stay connected to your struggles, but disconnected from your confidence. That pattern reveals more than words ever will. Some people only love the version of you that makes them feel emotionally secure. That realization is painful, but it explains many relationships adults silently struggle to understand, especially friendships built during periods where both people were emotionally wounded, insecure, lost, or dependent on external validation. Because once one person starts healing, growing, or emotionally stabilizing, hidden imbalance starts surfacing. And fake people often cannot fully hide the discomfort that creates inside them. Not because they are evil, but because insecurity becomes dangerous when identity depends on comparison. That's why emotionally secure people feel calming to be around. They do not compete with your happiness. They do not subtly punish your growth. They do not emotionally withdraw the moment you stop needing them. They can simply witness your success without feeling psychologically reduced by it. And that ability is far rarer than most people realize. Because the next sign fake people cannot hide forever goes even deeper than emotional competition. Eventually, fake people start revealing themselves through inconsistency between how they treat you publicly and how they treat you privately. The sixth silent sign of a fake person is the inability to sustain genuine empathy over time. And this is where many masks finally begin collapsing. Because empathy is difficult to fake consistently. Attention can be performed. Charm can be performed. Support can be performed. Even kindness can be performed temporarily. But genuine empathy requires something deeper. The ability to emotionally care about another person even when there is nothing immediate to gain from it. And fake people usually struggle there. At first, they may appear extremely empathetic. In fact, some fake individuals seem more emotionally attentive than genuinely authentic people. They ask thoughtful questions. They remember details. They study your emotions carefully. They know how to create the feeling of emotional intimacy very quickly. But eventually, something starts feeling transactional. You realize the empathy only appears strongly when emotional access still benefits them somehow. Their concern was deepest while emotional closeness still gave them value. That realization changes how you see the relationship entirely. Because real empathy usually feels emotionally safe. Performative empathy often feels emotionally strategic. And the difference becomes impossible to ignore once life becomes emotionally inconvenient. Stay with me here. A fake person often enjoys the appearance of being caring more than the long-term responsibility of actually caring. They like being perceived as emotionally intelligent, deeply understanding, psychologically aware, emotionally available. But real empathy is not built during emotionally intense conversations. Real empathy reveals itself during repetition, patience, inconvenience, misunderstandings, emotional exhaustion, conflict, ordinary days. And this is where performance usually starts weakening. Because some people learn empathy the same way actors learn emotion, as a behavior that creates emotional access, not necessarily as something deeply rooted inside them. You've probably experienced this before. Someone who seemed fascinated by your emotions at first slowly becomes irritated by the reality of emotionally supporting you long-term. Someone who encouraged vulnerability later weaponizes your insecurities during tension. Someone who once seemed deeply emotionally present suddenly becomes cold the moment your emotions stop being emotionally interesting, useful, dramatic, or validating to them. That shift reveals everything. Because real empathy remains present after emotional novelty disappears. Fake empathy usually does not. Some people enjoy feeling emotionally important to you more than they enjoy genuinely caring for you. That line explains more relationships than most people realize, especially relationships where support felt intense in the beginning, but unstable over time, where emotional closeness seemed powerful during vulnerable conversations, but strangely absent during ordinary emotional consistency. Fake empathy often burns intensely at first, because intensity creates attachment quickly. Real empathy usually feels quieter, more stable, less performative, less emotionally theatrical. That's why emotionally mature people often feel calming instead of intoxicating. They are not constantly managing emotional perception. They are not trying to manufacture emotional dependence. They are not carefully constructing emotional intimacy through performance. They are simply present. And presence is much harder to fake than intensity, because consistency eventually exposes everyone. Over time, fake people stop listening as carefully. Their patience becomes thinner. Their emotional investment becomes selective. Their empathy becomes conditional. The contradictions increase. And eventually, something inside the relationship changes. You stop feeling emotionally understood around them. You start feeling emotionally managed instead. That feeling matters, because fake people often know how to simulate emotional closeness long before they know how to sustain real emotional responsibility, and eventually, the performance weakens enough for something darker to appear underneath it. Because the next sign fake people cannot hide forever is not revealed through empathy, attention, or support. It reveals itself through the quiet satisfaction they feel when other people fail, struggle, or emotionally collapse. The seventh silent sign of a fake person is the quiet satisfaction they feel when other people struggle. And this is one of the darkest signs, because it is rarely expressed openly. Most fake people understand social consequences well enough to hide obvious cruelty. They know they cannot openly celebrate someone's failure without damaging the image they worked so hard to maintain. So the reaction becomes subtle. But subtle does not mean invisible. Pay attention to emotional energy during difficult moments. Some people become strangely more engaged when hearing bad news about others, more animated during gossip, more emotionally alive during someone else's failure than during someone else's success. That difference matters, because emotionally healthy people usually feel discomfort when someone they care about suffers. Even when complicated emotions exist, empathy still remains present somewhere inside the reaction. Fake people often reveal something different: relief. The failure of others quietly comforts people whose identity depends on comparison. That line explains more social behavior than most people realize. Because for deeply insecure people, another person's success can feel psychologically threatening. It creates comparison, inadequacy, emotional instability. But someone else struggling, that restores emotional balance for them. Now they feel safer again, more equal again, more emotionally comfortable again. And this is why some people subtly keep relationships emotionally centered around problems, weakness, insecurity, or dysfunction. Not consciously necessarily, but psychologically. You've probably experienced moments like this before. You share a struggle, and someone suddenly becomes intensely emotionally available, curious, present, invested. But when you later share growth, peace, confidence, or success, their emotional energy becomes flatter, quieter, less engaged. That contrast reveals more than words ever will, because some people connect more easily to your wounds than your evolution. And over time, that dynamic becomes emotionally dangerous. Stay with me here. A fake person often feels emotionally stabilized by other people remaining insecure, dependent, confused, or emotionally smaller around them. That is why your growth can quietly create distance inside relationships that once felt close. Not because confidence ruined the relationship, because insecurity was secretly helping sustain it. And this is where many adults finally begin understanding certain painful experiences from their past. The friend who slowly disappeared once your life improved. The person who seemed supportive, but became subtly dismissive when you gained confidence. The relationship that felt emotionally warm during struggle, but emotionally cold during healing. Those patterns are not random, because emotionally healthy people usually want expansion for the people they love. They do not need others to remain wounded in order to feel emotionally secure around them. Fake people often do. Not always maliciously, not always consciously, but consistently enough that the pattern eventually becomes undeniable. A person's character becomes visible in what secretly brings them emotional relief. That is why paying attention to emotional reactions matters so much. Who becomes uncomfortable when you succeed? Who becomes energized when someone fails? Who subtly enjoys gossip that lowers someone else socially? Who seems emotionally calmer when the people around them feel uncertain instead of confident? Those reactions reveal emotional character far more accurately than carefully chosen words ever will. Because fake people can rehearse supportive language. They can rehearse empathy. They can rehearse kindness. They can rehearse emotional intelligence. But emotional reactions are much harder to rehearse consistently over time. Eventually, real feelings leak through. And when they do, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Because the people who genuinely care about you usually feel emotionally safe when your life improves. Fake people often feel emotionally threatened by it instead. At some point, after enough patterns, enough contradictions, enough emotional confusion, you stop asking the most common question people ask about fake individuals. Are they a bad person? And you start asking a far more important question. How do they consistently make people feel over time? Because that is where truth usually lives. Not inside isolated moments. Not inside carefully chosen words. Not inside public image. Inside patterns. And this is the final thing fake people cannot hide forever. Patterns eventually overpower performance. At first, performance can be convincing. Sometimes extremely convincing. That's why fake people often confuse intelligent, empathetic, emotionally aware individuals the most. Because emotionally perceptive people tend to look for complexity, context, nuance, hidden pain, psychological explanations. And sometimes that empathy keeps them inside emotionally unhealthy dynamics much longer than they should stay. They keep explaining behavior instead of observing it. They understood the person's wounds so deeply that they stop protecting their own. That happens more often than people realize, especially with emotionally manipulative individuals who know how to alternate warmth and discomfort carefully enough to create confusion instead of clarity. One good moment, one bad moment, one emotionally intimate conversation, one subtle act of disrespect, one apology, one contradiction, one moment of support, one moment of emotional coldness. And because the behavior is inconsistent instead of constantly toxic, people remain emotionally attached to the potential of the relationship instead of the reality of it. Stay with me here. One of the hardest adult lessons to accept is that someone can occasionally care about you and still be unhealthy for you emotionally. Those two things can exist together. Because fake people are not always fake every second. Sometimes the warmth is real. Sometimes the affection is real. Sometimes the support is real. But inconsistency changes the emotional impact of everything. A person who only treats you well when it emotionally benefits them still creates instability around you, even if parts of the connection occasionally feel genuine. And over time, your body starts recognizing what your mind keeps trying to rationalize. You feel drained after interactions, more self-conscious around them, more emotionally cautious, more aware of tension, more mentally exhausted trying to interpret behavior that should not require constant interpretation. That feeling matters, because healthy relationships usually create clarity, not chronic confusion. Your nervous system often notices manipulation long before your mind fully accepts it. Tamil. That is why emotional exhaustion can become such an important signal, not temporary conflict, not ordinary misunderstandings, emotional exhaustion from constantly adapting yourself around someone else's instability, inconsistency, ego, or emotional unpredictability. And eventually, something changes. You stop focusing on isolated moments. You stop focusing only on intentions. You stop listening exclusively to words. You start studying patterns instead. And patterns are very difficult to fake forever, because time eventually removes emotional performance from almost everyone. The person becomes tired, less careful, more reactive, more transparent. The contradictions increase. The emotional mask slips faster. And suddenly, what once felt confusing starts feeling obvious. Not because the person changed overnight, because the pattern finally became impossible to deny. And that realization changes the way you move through life permanently. Because once you learn to trust behavioral consistency more than emotional performance, you stop getting emotionally attached to who people pretend to be, and start seeing who repeatedly appears underneath the performance instead. By the time fake people fully reveal themselves, the most painful part is usually not the deception itself. It is realizing how long you ignored what you already felt, because most people do sense the inconsistency early. The problem is that emotionally intelligent people often override their instincts in the name of empathy, patience, understanding, history, loyalty, or hope. They explain the behavior, minimize the discomfort, focus on potential instead of patterns, keep waiting for consistency from people who only offer temporary versions of it. And over time, that slowly disconnects them from their own emotional clarity. But eventually, reality becomes too repetitive to ignore. The contradictions accumulate. The emotional exhaustion accumulates. The confusion accumulates. The subtle tension accumulates. Until one day, something inside you stops trying to defend the image of the person and starts accepting the pattern instead. And that moment changes everything. Because clarity in adult relationships rarely arrives dramatically. It arrives quietly. You suddenly stop over-explaining someone's behavior. You stop chasing emotional consistency from emotionally inconsistent people. You stop trying to earn sincerity from people who only know how to perform it temporarily. And most importantly, you stop confusing emotional intensity with emotional safety. That distinction alone can change your entire life. Because fake people often create strong emotional experiences, intense conversations, fast closeness, deep vulnerability, psychological intimacy, emotional highs and lows that feel meaningful simply because they feel emotionally powerful. But emotional power is not the same thing as emotional safety. Not everyone who understands your emotions is safe for your nervous system. That truth takes many adults years to fully understand. Because someone can understand your wounds and still quietly use them. Someone can support parts of you and still compete with you internally. Someone can appear emotionally intelligent while lacking emotional integrity entirely. And this is why patterns matter more than isolated moments. Anyone can behave well temporarily. Anyone can sound emotionally aware temporarily. Anyone can perform kindness temporarily. But consistency always reveals what performance eventually cannot sustain. Stay with me here. The goal is not to become paranoid, not to distrust everyone, not to emotionally isolate yourself from people. The goal is something much healthier than that. To stop abandoning your own emotional perception every time someone presents a convincing image. Because your ability to notice emotional inconsistency is not weakness. It is awareness. Your discomfort is not always insecurity. Sometimes it is information. Your exhaustion is not always overthinking. Sometimes it is prolonged exposure to emotional instability your nervous system has been trying to process for months. And once you finally understand that, your relationships begin changing naturally. You stop being hypnotized by charm. You stop overvaluing words. You stop confusing attention with care. You stop ignoring subtle disrespect simply because it arrives politely. And slowly, something healthier begins happening. You start valuing people who feel consistent instead of impressive, calm instead of intoxicating, stable instead of performative, clear instead of confusing. Because genuine people usually bring emotional clarity into your life. Fake people usually bring emotional confusion. And once you experience the difference clearly enough, the mask becomes much easier to recognize before it fully falls. If this video helped you see certain behaviors more clearly, subscribe to the channel for more videos about psychology, emotional intelligence, human behavior, and the hidden patterns people reveal over time. And if someone came to mind while watching this video, don't ignore that feeling too quickly. Sometimes your emotional clarity notices the truth long before your logic feels ready to accept it.